You're listening to this podcast, so I know you've got a curious mind. Here's a helpful fact you might not know yet. Drivers who switch and save with Progressive save over $900 on average. They make it super simple. Pop over to Progressive.com, answer some questions, and you'll get a quick quote with coverage options tailored to your choices. Plus, you'll see which discounts you may qualify for, like the online quote discount or savings for paying in full. In fact, 99% of Progressive Auto customers earn at least one discount. See if you could save when you switch to Progressive. You'll feel good about making a savvy choice. Visit Progressive.com and see if you can enjoy a little extra cash back. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $946 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2024 and May 2025. Potential savings will vary.
To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
At first, it looked like a medical mystery. A healthy woman suddenly bedridden, her body failing one system at a time. No sign of trauma, no sign of infection. But as doctors searched for answers, one test revealed the truth. Peggy Carr wasn't sick. She was being murdered. Someone had slipped one of the most dangerous poisons on Earth, thallium, into her home, a substance that is colorless, tasteless, if mixed with the right drink. It attacks the body slowly, painfully, invisibly. And by the time doctors realized what was happening, it was already too late. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 307, The Murder of Peggy Carr. It can seem ordinary from the outside. A modest home in the quiet community of Alturas, Florida. A working mother doing her best for her children. A newly blended family hoping for a fresh start. That was the world of 41-year-old Peggy Carr in the fall of 1988. Peggy worked as a waitress at a local dine-in restaurant. She had 3 children from a previous marriage. Her husband, Peggy Carr, brought 2 children of his own. They were married only about 6 months before she started questioning things. From the beginning, the blending of the 2 families had its own set of challenges. And according to press reports, Peggy and Pye's relationship already showed cracks just a few months in. Peggy questioned the long hours her husband claimed that he was working at a nearby mine. Was he really working, or was something else going on? So one night, when Pye said he would be working late, Peggy drove out to the mine site and found only 2 cars in the parking lot. One belonged to Pye, but the other one belonged to a former girlfriend. It was like a light bulb going off in her head. She had a feeling something wasn't right. She followed her gut, and now this was confirmation. She wasn't making it up. She wasn't being dramatic. Pye was really cheating on her. So after that, Peggy decided to take her 3 kids and stay at a nearby hotel. On her way out, she left a note for Pye basically saying that she loved him but couldn't do this anymore. If he was going to be seeing another woman behind her back, she wanted out of this marriage. But the 2 didn't stay apart forever. After a brief separation, Peggy and the kids moved back in. But none of that meant everything went back to normal. Not everything was rainbows and butterflies inside the house. The same day that Peggy returned home, Pye left for a previously scheduled hunting trip. And while he was away, Peggy started feeling sick. At first, it was just a stomach ache, nothing to be too concerned about. But within days, the pain just got worse and worse. Her legs ached, her vision blurred. She struggled just to stay awake. This was some of the worst pain that she had ever been in. By the time Pi returned home, Peggy could barely get out of bed. But even at this point, he didn't think it was anything too serious. Even when the kids begged him to take her to the hospital, he brushed it off as a simple virus that was going around. He told the kids he thought she just needed some rest. If she could get just a couple good nights of sleep, drink a lot of water, she should be fine in just a couple of days. But that's not what happened. It wasn't the flu. Peggy just kept getting sicker and sicker. It was almost like every hour she just got worse and worse. She couldn't open her eyes, couldn't speak clearly, and her body felt like it was shutting down. So eventually, Peggy is rushed to the hospital, but doctors are stumped. All of the routine tests came back normal. No signs of infection, no injury, nothing that could explain what was going on. So after about 24 hours of observation, she was released with no answers. She was still in a lot of pain and didn't feel well, but there was nothing that doctors could do. All of the tests suggested she was fine. So why keep her in the hospital if they couldn't figure out what was going on? Some of the doctors even thought these symptoms may be psychosomatic, given how abnormal everything was. At this point, no one realized that the real cause of pain was far more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. Peggy should have never been released from the hospital and allowed to go home. The next day, her symptoms got even worse. And what's even scarier is that her children sat there and watched as her condition declined. As a kid, there's nothing worse than seeing one of your parents suffer or go through pain and not know what to do. But these were smart kids. They knew this couldn't be just a simple stomach virus like their father had said. So they begged him to take her back to the hospital. Peggy couldn't even walk. She had become basically paralyzed. But Pi said no. He didn't think that she should go back to the hospital. She would be fine at home. She just needed a little bit of rest. So instead of listening to the kids, Pi left and went to work. A few hours later, the kids couldn't take it anymore. Their mom was in trouble and she needed help. So they drove her to the emergency room themselves while Pi stayed at work. But this time, one of the doctors noticed something that the others had missed the day before. A lot of Peggy's hair was falling out. Every time she lifted her head from the pillow, a bunch of her hair would stay stuck to the bedding. So his first thought was that this had to be some type of poisoning. In a lot of poisoning cases, the patient's hair falls out like crazy. This was something the hospital had missed the day before. So this doctor ordered a more specific lab test to be done on Peggy. He wanted to see if there were any poisons or chemicals in her system that maybe the routine lab test might have missed. In that moment, what seemed like a medical mystery shifted into the realm of criminal investigation. Peggy did have poison in her system. Thallium, one of the most dangerous metals known to science. It's a highly toxic, colorless, and tasteless metal once found in rodent and ant poisons before it was banned in the United States back in 1972. It's odorless, dissolves easily in water, and has no distinct taste, making it nearly impossible to detect in food or drink without lab testing. Once inside the body, thallium begins to attack the nervous system, destroy nerve endings, and damage muscle tissue. Early symptoms can often look like the flu: stomach pain, nausea, tingling in the hands and feet. But as it spreads, it causes more serious symptoms: delirium, paralysis, coma, and even in many cases, death. This is a substance you definitely don't want inside your body, even at the smallest of levels. So just how much did Peggy have in her system? Forensic toxicologists later determined that her thallium levels were more than 50 times the maximum safe human exposure. And it wasn't like she had just received a single dose. She had been poisoned with thallium multiple times over an unknown period of time, but no one could figure out how or why. Was this some type of accidental exposure, or was someone intentionally poisoning her? When it comes to thallium poisoning, there is no treatment. Once it's in your system, it's in your system. And depending on how much there is, it can become fatal pretty quickly. So in Peggy's situation, doctors could only try to slow the poisoning's progression and ease her pain. But the damage had already been done. It was irreversible. Over the next day, her condition just got worse and worse until she eventually slipped into a coma. But Peggy wasn't the only one in the Carr family who ended up in the hospital. Just 2 days later, her two sons, her biological son and one of her stepsons, were hospitalized with the same symptoms, just not as severe. So fearing that they might have the same thing, doctors performed the same kind of advanced urine and blood tests. And when the results came back, they were what everyone had already suspected. Both of them had been poisoned with thallium as well. That's now 3 people in this one single family. By this point, it was no longer just a medical emergency. It was a full-blown public health crisis. If the poison had contaminated her home, who's to say that another innocent family wouldn't be next? So environmental scientists and health officials from the Florida Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services launched a full-scale investigation. Their goal was to figure out the source of the poison. So to begin, they began by testing every possible environmental source. The first was the orange grove next door to the Carr's property. The entire grove was tested for contaminants, but everything came back negative. The second place they looked at was the neighborhood's drinking water. The thought was that maybe the poison had somehow gotten into the water that the family was drinking. It's colorless. It's odorless. This family could drink water without knowing that it's contaminated with thallium. But once again, they got the same results. There was no trace of it. Plus, no one else in this neighborhood had any issues. It was just the Carr family. That's when investigators turned their attention inside the Carr home. Health officials collected air and dust samples, checked for chemical residues on countertops, furniture, and the kitchen surfaces. They had even removed more than 400 household items for lab testing. Everything from cookware to cleaning products to food containers, even open beverage bottles. While they waited for forensic chemists to go through everything, the authorities learned about something else that piqued their attention. A few months before Peggy and her sons got sick, the family had received a weird and strange threatening letter. In June 1988, Peggy Carr received an anonymous, typewritten letter that was addressed to him. Though his name was misspelled as P-I-E Carr instead of P-Y-E. The note read in all caps, "You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you all die. This is no joke." Not only was this a bizarre letter to receive, it also confused investigators. Up until this point, they suspected that maybe Peggy's husband, Pye, was behind the poisoning. They knew about the affair. They knew about all the other marital issues that they had before this happened. So they wondered if Pye could have had motive to want his wife dead or deathly ill. Was it possible he wanted her dead so that he could be with another woman? They had only been married for less than a year before this happened, and it certainly wouldn't be the first time a husband attempted to poison his wife. The police also wondered why he never mentioned the letter or the affair before. When they first sat down and spoke with him, he left out both of those details, so that was a pretty big red flag. They also knew that he was away on that hunting trip the first time that Peggy got sick. He also didn't want to take her to the hospital. He wanted her to stay home and rest. So all of this starts to point the finger at the husband. Could he have done this? Maybe he wrote the threatening letter to himself to try to throw off investigators. It wouldn't be the first time someone's done that either. And it wasn't just the cops who suspected Pye. The kids also thought that he could be responsible. They thought he was acting strange at the time. He was very secretive. It just felt like he had something to hide. That came from the couple's own kids. Doctors ordered tests for everyone living in the Carr household, and the results were shocking. Nearly every family member, Peggy, her children, even her husband Pye, had dangerous levels of thallium in their system. The children's results showed that they'd been slowly poisoned over time, just like their mother. The only person in the home who tested completely negative was Pye's teenage daughter, who lived part-time with her biological mother and hadn't been staying at the house regularly. That piece of information was crucial for two reasons. One, Pye was probably innocent. And number two, it meant the poison wasn't coming from the environment. It was coming from inside the Carr home. When the lab results from the household items finally came back, investigators were shocked. Several bottles of Coca-Cola taken from the Carr home tested positive for thallium. The poison had been mixed directly into the soda, the same bottles the family had been drinking for weeks. The police returned to the home and found 3 full bottles of Coca-Cola from the same carton that had been used in the household. But despite the obvious signs of tampering, no usable fingerprints were found on the outside of the bottles. That's when scientists employed a scanning electron microscope to inspect the bottle caps and sealing area, magnified roughly 100 times, and discovered tiny scratch marks on the caps, consistent with the seals having been removed and replaced in a very deliberate manner. Right away, this suggested that whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They had some level of skill and expertise at doing something like this. When the bottles were chemically tested, they were found to contain a lethal dose of thallium. One lab report described how the soda produced a greenish color in a flame test, a classic indicator used in forensic toxicology to signal the presence of thallium. One test even revealed that each of the 3 bottles contained more than a gram of the poison, which was more than enough to kill an adult. With that piece of evidence in hand, tampered bottles matched with poison test and family illness, the investigation shifted in focus to a criminal poisoning case. Investigators quickly learned that thallium doesn't dissolve easily. In most liquids, it causes visible cloudiness, bubbling, and sediment toward the bottom. Anyone pouring a drink would likely notice that something was off. But whoever poisoned the Carr family knew how to avoid detection. When mixed with carbonated soda, the fizz and acidity of the drink will basically hide those warning signs. The carbonation kept the solution clear, concealing both the color change and the metallic residue that normally forms. To toxicologists, that detail spoke volumes. This wasn't the work of an impulsive killer or someone guessing with household chemicals. It suggested a person with specific scientific knowledge, someone who understood chemistry, precision, and how to manipulate a poison without leaving obvious traces. This wasn't something that you or I could probably pull off. Back at the hospital, Peggy's condition only got worse, and her family started preparing for the worst. Her nervous system had been irreversibly damaged by the thallium coursing through her body. Her teenage son and stepson were also in serious condition, both weak, disoriented, and struggling to walk, but doctors believed they would eventually recover. So while the hospital worked to keep Peggy alive, investigators turned to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit for help identifying who could commit such a deliberate and complex crime. This is the criminal profile they came up with. They said that the killer was likely a highly intelligent white male, probably in his 30s. Someone who resolved conflicts indirectly, avoiding direct confrontation, but seeking control through calculated means. He was methodical, organized, and possibly fascinated by death. The kind of person who might read extensively about murder, watch violent crime stories, and fantasize about committing the perfect crime himself. The FBI profiler noted that poisoners are often compared to bombers. Both rely on precision, patience, and distance. Poison, they said, is a coward's weapon. Now here's something else the FBI thought. Given how the thallium was placed, hidden inside soda bottles without anyone seeing, agents believed the poisoner had to be someone familiar with the family's routines, someone who knew when they would be home and when they wouldn't. So given that theory, the FBI's next suggestion was simple: start with the neighbors. To paint a picture of where the Carr family lived, they lived in rural Alturas, Florida, and their home sat along a dirt road surrounded by orange groves and open land. Out there, neighbors were few and far between. In fact, the Carrs only had one immediate neighbor, a man named George Trapal. George was described as a smart but eccentric man in his early 40s. He worked as a freelance computer programmer and writer known for his love of puzzles, science fiction, and chemistry. His wife, Dr. Diana Carr, no relation to Peggy's family, was a respected physician who worked long hours at a local hospital. To outsiders, George seemed polite but a little strange. He was even a member of Mensa, the high IQ society, and prided himself on his intellect. But those who lived nearby, including the Carrs, found him difficult, even confrontational. He had a short fuse for noise, clutter, or anything that disturbed his sense of order. George had reportedly argued with the Carr children about parking, loud music, and even a barking dog. At one point, he accused the kids of trespassing and made repeated complaints to local authorities. The tension between the two households had been simmering for months. Now, after Peggy's poisoning and the FBI's behavioral profile, those conflicts suddenly seemed far more significant. Investigators began to wonder if their quiet, strange neighbor next door might also be the suspect they were looking for. When detectives ran a background check on George, they uncovered something strange. He wasn't just a quirky neighbor with a short temper. He had a criminal past. Back in the 1970s, George had been arrested in North Carolina for operating a large-scale meth lab. Investigators at the time described it as one of the most sophisticated drug operations they had ever seen. One officer later remarked that George was the smartest chemist he had ever met. This essentially confirmed what the FBI profile had already suggested. The person behind Peggy Carr's poisoning was intelligent, methodical, and deeply familiar with chemistry. Someone who knew exactly how to handle toxic substances and how to cover their tracks. After 4 long months in a coma, Peggy Carr passed away on March 3rd, 1989. She was just 41 years old. Despite every effort to save her, the damage from the thallium poisoning couldn't be fixed. Her nervous system had completely shut down, leaving her family to make the heartbreaking decision to let her go. At this point, it's a homicide investigation, and George Trapal was suspect number 1. But there was a problem. There wasn't any physical or forensic evidence tying him to what happened, so they decided to go undercover. Investigators learned that George and his wife, Dr. Diana Carr, were active members of Mensa, the high IQ society known for its puzzles and social gatherings. So in early 1990, the Polk County Sheriff's Office sent an undercover agent, a woman named Susan, to infiltrate the group and befriend George. Susan attended a Mensa murder mystery weekend, a themed event hosted by George and Diana. Each year, George wrote elaborate mystery scenarios for members to solve. And when Susan arrived, she was handed one of his scripts, a story about a murder committed by poison. It was exactly the kind of crime that George seemed to fantasize about. Being very good at her job, Susan quickly gained his trust, and the two developed a close friendship, meeting for lunch and sharing personal stories. George even appeared flattered by her attention, and over time, he shared things with her, like little details about chemistry, about how easy it was to kill someone without being caught. About a year later, George and Diana decided to buy a new home in a different part of Florida. By that point, Susan's cover was so good that George actually offered to rent his old home out to her. She accepted. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Susan moved in before the couple had even finished moving out, and once she was safely inside, homicide detectives moved in right behind her. They began a search of his entire property, including the small workshop behind his house where George had spent countless hours by himself. And inside that small shed, investigators found an assortment of chemical containers and lab glassware. And when the FBI tested the contents of one unmarked bottle, the results were unmistakable. It contained thallium. It was the first piece of direct physical evidence linking George to Peggy's murder. Police later executed a search warrant at George's new home, where they discovered a notebook titled General Poisoning Guide. Inside were handwritten notes and excerpts from toxicology texts, including information about death by poison and the chemical properties of thallium. That was enough. George Trapal was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Peggy Carr and the attempted murder of the rest of her family. As far as motive goes, the police believed it all came down to one thing: anger. George had been infuriated by his neighbors, the Carr family, for months. Their noise, the clutter, the kids, everything about them pissed him off. And when his typed threat letter failed to scare them away, he decided to take a more direct, a more permanent approach. Using his background in chemistry, George purchased bottles of soda, carefully removed the caps with specialized tools, and replaced them after secretly adding thallium. He chose thallium for a reason. It's colorless, tasteless, and nearly undetectable in standard lab tests. It was the perfect poison for someone who wanted his victims to suffer and to get away with it. To investigators, the crime felt hauntingly familiar. The method, the precision, even the choice of poison, all of it mirrored the fictional murder scenario George had written for that Mensa murder mystery weekend. In his story, the victim was poisoned in almost the exact same way. In 1991, 2 years after Peggy's death, George stood trial in Polk County, Florida, charged with first-degree murder and 6 counts of attempted murder. The prosecution presented a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but each piece built a very strong argument. They had the threatening letter, the thallium-filled Coca-Cola bottles, the chemistry equipment found in his shed, the general poisoning guide notebook, and the eerie murder mystery script that looked identical to Peggy's death. They also had motive. Prosecutors argued that George's obsessive need for order and his resentment toward the Carr's family noise and chaos drove him to kill. But the defense countered that there was no direct proof placing George at the Carr home or showing him tampering with the soda bottles. But jurors were unconvinced. After weeks of testimony, the jury found him guilty on all counts. During sentencing, the judge had some pretty harsh words for him. He called his crime cold, calculated, and premeditated, describing it as one of the most methodical acts of cruelty he had ever seen. And in the end, the sentence he handed down matched his harsh words. George was sentenced to death for Peggy's murder and to life imprisonment for the attempted murder of her family. And in another note, both of her sons survived the poisoning. So what did George have to say about everything? Well, throughout the trial and even after the verdict, he maintained his innocence, showing very little emotion as the sentence was handed down. He denies any involvement despite the mountain of circumstantial and forensic evidence. That brings us to today. More than 3 decades later, George remains on Florida's death row, still claiming he's innocent. All of his appeals over the years have been denied. For investigators, the case stands as one of the most chilling examples of forensic toxicology in action. Proof that even an invisible poison leaves traces for science to uncover. Peggy Carr's death revealed just how far a person could go to satisfy their anger, and how meticulous forensic work can expose the truth hidden behind chemistry, lies, and calculation. In the end, it wasn't luck that solved this case, it was science. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Sherry A., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Lois B., Lynn H., Danielle D., Lucretia W., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Courtney C. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at Courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.